So, part 2, going down my list here. This is a great little book. It's actually not so little. How Capitalism Saved America by Tom DiLorenzo. Tom DiLorenzo is another author associated with the Mises Institute. This book, I enjoyed it far more than I thought I would. It looks at... Here's another way to put it. Now, I mentioned Thomas Woods. Tom Woods is a historian by training who in his books, he gives a historian's perspective, often talking about economic matters. Now, Tom DiLorenzo is an economist. And when he writes history books, he brings an economist's perspective into history, which I think is fascinating. So he looks at the history of America from the standpoint of how free was America's economy at different stages in its history. He talks about what capitalism is, and what it is not. He talks about the essence of the system. He talks about where the anti-capitalist mentality comes from, and explores that a little bit. He talks about everything from the Pilgrims, from the very first settlers, how capitalism was a factor in what happened in the first several seasons over here when the settlers first came. America's capitalist revolt, highways of capitalism, how capitalism enriched the working class, the truth about the robber barons, antitrust myths, did capitalism create the Great Depression, how the New Deal crippled capitalism, did capitalism cause the energy crisis, the never-ending war on capitalism. Those are the chapter names. Now, I don't know, if you're even remotely interested in sorting out through tons of garbage that we receive from the so-called media outlets every day, if you want to construct your own, cohesive view of the economy and the history and what this nation is and what works and what doesn't in real life, I suggest that you take the time and read this book. And it's going to be especially illuminating because it's going to take what happened in this country and give you a perspective that I'm sure you don't have, because I don't see a lot of books exploring these same subjects out there from the same perspective. Basically, when you read this, you will see, I hope, that freedom works and state intervention doesn't, that people left to their own devices often come out richer, happier than they were before, and whenever you have state intervention, which is essentially legitimized violence, you have poverty, you have decreased wealth, obviously decreased freedoms, and overall misery. But, don't take my word for it. Again, read the book. It's got tons of historical examples. It's got tons of references to very specific events. So, How Capitalism Saved America by Tom DiLorenzo. Now, one of the chapters in his book was called The Myth of the Robber Barons, which is the title of this book. The Myth of the Robber Barons by Burton Folsom Jr. Now, this book is actually very short, and you can buy it used for like pennies. So I strongly suggest that you do pick it up and read it. Now, it talks about the people that you've heard a lot about, I'm sure. Even if you grew up here and got your education in the public schools, you've heard a lot of unflattering stuff about the following individuals. Commodore Vanderbilt, James J. Hill, the railroad tycoon, the Scrantons, the Scranton family, built the steel industry in Pennsylvania, Charles Schwab and the steel industry, John D. Rockefeller and the oil industry, Andrew Mellon and the 20s. Those were the names of the chapters in this book. Now, prepare to be surprised. I mean, if you haven't educated yourself already on these subjects and on these men, prepare to be surprised and prepare to learn a lot of useful stuff. Everything you think you know about John D. Rockefeller, for example, is a lie. And it's actually not that difficult to debunk. The history is all out there. The data is all out there. The information is, open for anyone who's seeking it. But a perspective that Mr. Folsom here brings allows you to understand what those people, including people like Vanderbilt and John D. Rockefeller and some of the others, what they really did. They actually single-handedly, many times, revolutionized their respective industries. They created new classes of products. They created new industries altogether, creating millions of jobs for hundreds of years ahead, because of their single-minded obsession with doing what they were doing. You know, Rockefeller was crazy about oil. He was involved in all stages of oil production, from barrel design to factory construction and railroad shipping. He would actually micromanage the minute details of how the entire process would work, because he was a genius. He knew what he was doing, and you know, he created a product, cheap kerosene, that made home illumination affordable for the working class. But don't let me tell you the story. Read the story yourself. The Myth of the Robber Baron. The title speaks for itself, I believe. You need to read this in order to understand, among other things, how deeply fucked up the system of public education in America is. Now, the next book is very important. Charles Murray, Losing Ground. If you want to understand welfare, how it works, or rather how it doesn't work, and what it does to people, and why, you need to read this book. This is a seminal work. In fact, this person is no conservative. This person is no libertarian either. He is not against welfare. He set out to write this book, and this was published, I think, in 1980, or even before that. Look, let me just take a look real quick. Oh no, it was published by 1984, but the data that he looks at stops at 1980. It's actually called Losing Ground: American Social Policy, 1950 through 1980. He set out to write a book about welfare because he was in favor of welfare. And what he discovered shocked him very deeply. And I don't want to give away the entire book, but, you know, I'm going to give you the gist of it, but just because I say this doesn't mean the book is not worth reading. It's worth, every page of it is worth reading. It's very illuminating. It gives you a very, very useful insight into the history of the welfare movement, and how the minds of the people and their relation, sort of their attitude towards the welfare as a phenomenon changed over time, and how the myth of state-run welfare was sold to the public. But basically he discovered this: there's no way to organize what he calls a social transfer program, meaning taking money from, you know, some people to give to others in order to alleviate what is perceived as a social evil. There's no way to do that without further aggravating, exaggerating that same social evil. In other words, on net, any social program, any social transfer program, or in other words, any welfare program is on net harmful. Okay? As shocking as it sounds, he actually gives a very convincing explanation as to why. And again, he was not, and is not, against welfare. He was completely puzzled and dismayed by the fact that it doesn't work. Even if you support the goals of welfare, which I don't, but he did. He does. It just doesn't work. If you pay money, if you pay people money in order to lift them from a certain condition, you inevitably create a greater incentive for the people to enter into and remain in that said condition. Enough said. Read the book, Losing Ground. You must read it. Now, last but not least, that's some book. Julian Simon, The Ultimate Resource 2, second edition. Julian Simon, the reason you need to understand this book is because it gives you invaluable tools to understand all the alarmist scares that have been peddled, and are being peddled by the news media, have been peddled by the news media for the last 1, 2, 3, 4 decades. Everything from global warming to the global food crisis to the ozone layer to the depletion of resources. In order to really understand all those things, well, what Julian Simon did, he's an economist. Was an economist. He's been dead for a few years now, but he brings a unique economic perspective into analyzing what resources actually are, what makes, you know, things resources. I will leave you with this phrase, and it's not a phrase. It's an idea contained in his book. The only real true resource is the human mind. That's how we make stuff that we find in this world into resources. Julian Simon, Ultimate Resource, second edition. Enjoy.